So, is Taiwan part of China? A very controversial subject, and I figured I'd chime in on this because I lived in Taiwan 3 years. I've lived in China over 10 years. And I also studied my master's degree in Taiwan, and that study was mostly looking at why Taiwanese were so successful from an economic perspective. But I kind of looked a little bit in the interviews what people basically thought of, this idea is Taiwan part of China. So I'll try to give an objective perspective from the Chinese side, the Taiwanese side, and what foreigners generally think. I'll give a brief history to give you a background, and also some really important historical things that happened at the end of World War II and the Korean War, which actually have a lot to do with how things are today. And I'll mention why it's so important for China, not just from a nationalist perspective, but from a military perspective. And then at the end of the video, I'll give my opinion on if I think China will invade Taiwan soon, or if they will at all. So to begin with, it was definitely not like a big part of China. It was actually an island of Austronesian people, more or less people like from Polynesia, down from like New Zealand all the way up to Taiwan, basically the Southeast Pacific. The people were probably there 20, 30,000 years ago. Even today, Taiwan has 16 nationally recognized tribes of indigenous people. The majority of people there today are Han Chinese, but 500 years ago, the majority of people there were Aboriginal people. So, of course, over the last couple thousand years, people from Japan and China and other areas had visited the island for trading and fishing and different things. There was probably only a couple thousand Chinese who were there when it was the Dutch East Indian Company, which established a base in southwest Taiwan around 1624. In the area which is now Tainan today. And so that was kind of the first time someone tried to kind of occupy Taiwan, and they had most of the west coast, basically. Taiwan's mountains go up to like 13,000 feet, so no one ever was able to easily conquer those areas in the mountains, and that's often where most of the Aboriginal people ended up moving from the plains as more and more Chinese came over the years. The Spanish briefly were in Danshui. They got driven out by the Dutch. And then after the Dutch were in Taiwan for about 3-4 decades, the Qing Dynasty was collapsing at that time. And so, of course, you had a lot of people moving to Taiwan who were fleeing. And one of the generals there, who was still loyal to the Qing Dynasty, fled mainland China and invaded the Dutch in Taiwan. And they had like, 25,000 people, and the Dutch had like 2,000. So it was no surprise that the Dutch lost because they weren't reinforced. And he was in charge of Taiwan for about 3 decades or so. And then the Qing Dynasty came and invaded and made Taiwan part of China. And later it became a province. So for 2 centuries, it was part of China, but not a very important part of China. It wasn't like there was a lot of development or anything like that. They were doing a little bit more in the late 1800s. But also by the late 1800s is when Japan started modernizing and taking over other areas. And so as Japan started expanding, they had a series of victories over China, and in 1895, Taiwan became a colony of Japan until they lost the World War II in 1945. So during those 50 years, the Japanese modernized Taiwan. They put in the railroads, they developed the first banks, and they also, of course, wanted the people to be more like Japanese. So they really wanted the people to assimilate more into Japanese culture, which would be a problem later on for the local people. And so in 1945, Japan loses the war, and Taiwan goes back to being part of mainland China. And at that time, it was the Kuomintang that were in charge of China, and they were still fighting the communists in a civil war. So now when the Chinese took over Taiwan, the local people who were mostly Han Chinese were happy, but the problem is that the Japanese were actually well-funded and well-organized and did quite a lot of good things for Taiwan during the time it was a colony. I mean, of course, there were some really bad things that happened with the indigenous people and some of the Han Chinese there. But overall, it was probably considered a pretty decent experience. When the Chinese came, the soldiers and the people weren't very sophisticated. They were very poor, not very well educated. And those Chinese, the new group who came, also resented the Taiwanese because they were like Japanese. And the Japanese were the people they had been fighting for like 15 years already. So as you can imagine, it didn't take much time for a lot of animosity. The Chinese that had come had obviously taken over all of the monopolies and everything that the Japanese had. And even the Japanese had tried to kind of integrate the local people into the government more, where most of the Taiwanese at that time just got pushed out completely, you know, and all of the new people who came from mainland basically took over. And so the tensions were super high within a year. And in February 28th, 1946, a woman was selling cigarettes, which was contraband. And one of the soldiers like hit her with the butt of a gun or something like that. And then there was like some protests. A guy was shot by one of the soldiers and killed. And then the next day, like the whole entire island kind of erupted in protests. They took over many government buildings all over the island. And so at this time, Chiang Kai-shek and most of the army and people were still in mainland fighting the communists. So they basically had enough problems on the mainland. They were losing against the communists. The last thing they need is a huge rebellion in Taiwan. And so they had a brutal crackdown on those protests. And it's anywhere from a few thousand up to, I think, 28,000 people died during this response to these protests. And so they enacted martial law from that time in the 1940s all the way up until like the late 80s or early 90s. So although we look at today as a democracy and really open, it's only been like that for about 30 years or so. So by 1949, Chiang Kai-shek lost the mainland and had retreated with about 1.2 million people to Taiwan. And they mostly set up in Taipei. And so you basically have the Taiwanese who were there, you know, for maybe several decades or several centuries. There was about 6.5 million of them. The Japanese had mostly all been sent back to Japan during that time. And you've got this big group who took over. And so right away, because of the martial law and because of this 228 incident, which they call the White Terror, these two groups of people have traditionally disliked each other for decades, as I mentioned. And so that remained the situation for several decades. I mean, it's reflected in the politics today. Right now, the Kuomintang is the main party that's in Taipei, and the rest of Taiwan is mostly other parties. And so in 1949, 1950, the big plan for mainland China, for Mao Zedong, was to take Taiwan. And the U.S. policy at this time was like, it was a lost cause. Like, they thought Chiang Kai-shek was going to lose. It doesn't matter. The United States really wasn't going to support it that much until the Korean War happened in June of 1950. So this was a big deal because the invasion of Korea, and later, a few months into that war, the Chinese joined North Korea, which was really the most substantial army the United States and the UN was fighting. There was a few thousand North Koreans fighting, but the vast majority were actual Chinese, about 1.5 million versus a few 100,000 South Koreans and allied forces, basically. And so that's when they moved the Navy to Taiwan to prevent mainland China from taking Taiwan, and they actually wanted to stop Taiwan from taking mainland China at that time. And so a lot of Chinese don't really look at that point too much. They think that the United States wanted to have a big influence the entire time, and actually it wasn't true. If the Korean War was delayed for a couple more years, China probably would have been able to take Taiwan, and that would have actually changed history, but it was the Korean War that changed the fate of Taiwan in its own favor. And also at that time then, from 1950 to 1965, Taiwan got about $1.5 billion in U.S. aid, which was the most of any country during the Cold War at that time. And so they didn't just give them money, they had to open up some more free market ideals. They said, you know, look at Japan, look at Hong Kong with some more free market ideals and look at how their economy is going. You need to be more of a free market economy, because it's not like he had those opinions when he was living in China before. from the 1950s until the 1970s, most of the world recognized that, like, the Kuomintang or Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan was the legitimate ruler of Taiwan and China, basically. And of course, that changed in the 70s when the United States and Nixon visited with Henry Kissinger, and they established relationships with mainland China. And basically what they said is that, like, they would support Taiwan militarily with arms and weapons, but it was they still recognized China, at least at that point. And so basically by the 80s and the 90s, Taiwan ended up becoming a democracy. So that's a really big deal for the local people, because obviously this new group of Chinese came in the late 40s, had this brutal suppression, took over all the major industries, and it took them 4 or 5 decades to become a democracy. So why would those people want another group from mainland China to come in who says they're going to be open-minded, like, let's say, one country, two systems, when they don't even see that happening in Hong Kong? And so that's why there's a lot of resistance, because I don't think a lot of Chinese people in the mainland know this thing that happened in 228. It took them 5 decades to get democracy. Why would they want to throw that all away and have to fight for another, 50 years or 100 years or however long, or maybe not ever, to get a democracy? And so there's really no benefit for the local Taiwanese to be very favorable to China. Now, the people in Taipei, like you could say, like the new Chinese who got there in 1949, they're a little bit more favorable to the idea of being part of China, but it's still more as like part of China, but they still have their own like political and economic system. And the problem with that is that they have been looking at this policy that was supposed to be enacted in Hong Kong when it went back to mainland China in 1997. They were supposed to have a lot of autonomy, and that hasn't happened, as we've seen in the last few years with the Yellow Umbrella Revolution and all this stuff just before COVID. They were supposed to have a lot more autonomy, and that's not what's happening. And so obviously people in Taiwan see that. So if Hong Kong had been given more autonomy, they might be more into the aspect of being part of China, but being separate politically and economically. And so in my 3 years there, honestly, I didn't really meet anyone who wanted to be part of China. I mean, most of the people I knew were probably 35 and under. I did meet some older people who were favorable to the idea of being part of China, but still having their own political and economic system. I met maybe one taxi driver in all of my 3 years in Taiwan who said, oh, they should be part of China, and had a favorable view. But that was about it. So a lot of people, I think, in mainland China think that Taiwanese people want to be part of China, and it's definitely not the case, because they know it won't be on favorable terms for them. And so what is the Chinese perspective on Taiwan? Almost every single person in China believes that Taiwan should be part of China. I'd say 99.9% probably. Now, you will get a few people who have like lived abroad in Australia or other Western countries for several years, or went to university abroad. And they're a little bit more like, you see both sides, why Taiwanese might not want to be part of China and that kind of thing. But for the people in mainland China, there's not much of a difference of opinion on that subject. So as we know, most foreign people in Western countries believe Taiwan should be a democracy and should have the option of being independent. And, I mean, I think it's always easy for people to have an easy opinion on a different country. Like, for instance, if you're from China, you could say, oh, sure, I believe that, Texas and California could be separate. No big deal. But when you talk about your own country, you want to preserve it more. So I think it's easy, for a lot of foreigners just say, oh, well, whatever, it should just be part of, whatever they want. If they want to be separate. But that's easy for people to say from the outside. But from the Chinese perspective, there's a few more things than just nationalism. But even from a military perspective, China is already surrounded by a lot of countries who could be hostile, right? The biggest country to the southwest would be India, which they've had scuffles with over the years. They even had a war with Vietnam in 1979. It was because Vietnam had pushed out the Khmer Rouge from Cambodia. And so China was pissed because that was their ally, and they attacked Vietnam. And of course, Vietnam had a big counterattack, and it was a stalemate, basically. But So they've got like Vietnam, of course, Laos wouldn't be a big issue, but India's a big issue. Pakistan, they have good relations, so that's not too much of a big issue. Those Central Asian countries aren't that powerful, and they have pretty good relations as far as I know, but there's still a lot of borders with those countries. And then, of course, Russia, who, although they do have good relations with Russia, over the years, it's been off and on. I mean, they've had bad relations during the Cold War, and they were very close to coming to war at times. So that's not a stable partner either. And then, of course, to the east, you've got South Korea and Japan and some other countries. So, and of course, I think they're especially concerned with Japan because Japan's been building up their military quite a bit in the last 10 years, and it's going to continue to grow. Initially, following World War II, they weren't supposed to develop their military, and the United States was supposed to protect them forever. But because of the change in the geopolitics, everything's changing, and now Japan's building up. So would it be a good idea for China to attack? Well, in some ways it would be, you know. I mean, with Biden and the Democrats, they're probably not as strong as a Republican, and that might change in 2 years. And they might be at a good point to do it. But at the same time, with what's happened in Russia, with the Ukrainian invasion, that hasn't gone very well. My guess is that they probably won't do anything that soon. I think this will still drag on for another 5 or 10 years. But I do believe that Xi Jinping's final legacy will probably be to take over Taiwan by the time he leaves office. When that happens, I don't know, if it's before he dies, if it's in 10 or 20 years. But I think that would be a big thing that they try to accomplish. I think many people assume it would be kind of like Ukraine and Russia, where it would be two, you know, armies and missiles and navies and Air Force fighting very hard. But I would imagine China has a lot of people who are pro-China in Taiwan already, because of course both sides have had spies over the years for, I mean, that's for decades and decades. I don't know what that number is, but I guarantee you they're in pretty strategic positions to be able to really disrupt the Taiwanese defense against China. So it could be something more like a coup, for instance. They've got a lot of people on the inside. There's, you know, a few exchange of missiles and bombings and attacks over like a few days. It happens basically faster than anyone assumes. And so the international response would take, you know, usually takes like a few weeks. And by then it's already part of China. That's kind of what I would think would happen. Having a huge, like, big assault, like with what Russia did. They basically lined up all of their tanks on the border. Everyone knew it was going to happen for a few weeks, and then they attacked. I think this is going to be something like in the middle of the night, suddenly some paratroopers and people come in and different things. They blow out a few strategic areas. The local people don't have quite the will to fight as the Ukrainians might, and it might just happen, you know, out of the blue at any time. So it's going to be interesting. I think there's going to be, you know, like I said, a few more years, 5 or 10 years till it happens, but it definitely could happen at any time. Just last week, I saw 2 warships, one from the United States and one from China, almost hit each other in the Taiwan Strait. And so, you know, that could be an accident too, where 2 boats fire on each other, and it just out of nowhere, there's a big war for that reason too. But there's no doubt there's a huge military importance for having Taiwan. If you haven't noticed, I mean, the South China Sea and their area is huge, all the way down to the Philippines. They don't want Taiwan to be a base of, you know, hostile powers, not just Taiwan, but if Japan was there, the United States. During World War II, Japan used Taiwan as a base of all of their operations to attack South China, Hainan Island, the Philippines. And in general, in the 1800s and 1900s, China had been attacked by many, many countries besides Japan. You know, the British, the Portuguese, and many other countries. So they really aren't going to let Taiwan go easily. It's just a huge part of national pride and an economic and military importance. So I hope the negotiations to be reunified do go well, but it's probably not going to go that great. And as I mentioned, I did that thesis paper, and I interviewed about a dozen people, mostly from Taiwan, but I think 1 or 2 Chinese people and an American woman had been living there for decades. And anyway, one of the women had a really interesting point about this subject of, like, you know, is Taiwan separate from China and stuff. And she said, you should know, you're an American. when people immigrate to a new place, their identity is different. And that really makes a lot of sense. Like, for instance, there's Chinese people or Afghan people or people from Germany or Brazil or Mexico coming to the United States. Now, that first generation might still act very Chinese or Brazilian or Iraqi or whatever, but their kids are definitely going to be much more American. They do lose their sense of identity of where they're from. And plus, like, you know, when the Americans got there, they did mix with many other different groups and some native people. And that's the same thing with Taiwan. They mixed in with some of the indigenous Aboriginal tribes. And they spoke a different language for the most part. Most of them were speaking a Fujian language. So the local Taiwan language is basically like Fujian. And then the people in Taipei and the mainlanders who came in 1949 were mostly speaking Mandarin, or what Chiang Kai-shek spoke, which was kind of a language up in Zhejiang, a kind of Wu dialect or something. So that was really interesting. So from that perspective, I do understand that they really lost that strong identity with China. They have that horrible history when the Kuomintang got there. Of course, these Aboriginal people have no identification with Chinese at all. So it's a really tough situation for the local people. And so I think a lot of people in mainland China should understand this incident from 228, the fact that these local people don't have a strong identity with China, especially outside Taipei, because they haven't lived in mainland China for, you know, it could be a few hundred years. And then also the very last thing is that the Kuomintang brought a lot of the national treasures and the like traditional Chinese characters and a lot of the traditional culture, whereas mainland China went communist and got rid of a lot of the traditions. So even the people who are from China, who live in Taiwan from, you know, who got there in like the 40s or whatever, they look at China as like not keeping the traditions they like Buddhism and different things like that. And then, of course, they were part of Japan for 50 years, so they feel kind of Japanese as well. So they have this really big mix of very different influences, and they've been apart from China for the most part for most of their entire history. The time of those 2 centuries during the Qing Dynasty was not very significant. And so there's not this big connection. So it's a really tough situation. So to summarize the question, is Taiwan part of China or should it be? Well, I think everyone's right in their assessment. You know, the Chinese are right in their assessment that it should be part of China. Taiwanese are right to be apprehensive about going back to China, and obviously many do want to have independence. And then the foreign perspective could also be correct, that it should be independent if they want to be, and it's a bastion of democracy, which, quite frankly, in a lot of East Asia, there's not a lot of democracies. So people think if Taiwan's lost, it's a huge blow for democracy in the world. I understand that perspective too. And so all these sides, though, are very understandable, in my opinion. There's not a right answer. So anyway, I hope this video helped you understand Taiwan a bit more. I hope this history and this background that I have and some of the other voices and people who have talked to me over the years kind of help give everyone a better perspective, whether you're a foreigner, Taiwanese, or Chinese. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. I've got a lot of other videos about China and my experiences biking around the world in the military, hiking the Appalachian Trail, fishing in Alaska, and tons of other things. So I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you later. Take care.